Sterling Vance froze in the doorway of the floral wallpapered bedroom, his tall frame blocking the thin strip of morning light from the hall. His eyes locked on the scene before him. Hazel, his 8-year-old daughter, curled in a torn pink dress on the sunken mattress, one hand tangled in the thick fur of Rook, the other resting on Valor's bandaged leg. The two German shepherds, once his trusted K9 partners, lay like sentries on either side of her, their eyes sharp, bodies still. Rain from the night before clung to their coats, and a faint smear of dried blood marked the doorframe. Sterling stepped inside, heart pounding, disbelief settling into his chest like stone. He'd been told Rook and Valor were retired after the warehouse fire. Retired hadn't looked like this. Marin, his ex-wife, appeared behind him, her voice low but steady. They limped in last night. Hazel wouldn't sleep unless they stayed. The weight of her words pressed against him, and in that moment his purpose became clear: protect Hazel and find out who had sent his old partners home wounded. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below the video. Thank you, amen. Briar Hollow, Virginia was the sort of small town where autumn came early and stayed long, the maples in late September already burning red against a pale sky. A light mist hung over the crooked main street that morning, softening the lines of the diner, the post office, and the clapboard houses. The air carried a faint scent of wood smoke and wet leaves. Sterling Vance had flown in on his own jet at dawn, not with his usual entourage of aides and chauffeurs, but alone, in a rental sedan that still smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. For a man who normally inhabited glass-walled conference rooms and penthouse apartments, the quiet of Briar Hollow felt foreign, almost hostile. Sterling Vance, at 44, carried himself with the calculated composure of someone who had made and lost millions more than once. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly kept beard that traced the hard angles of his jaw. His eyes, a sharp steel blue, missed very little, though lately they had a tendency to drift toward the horizon, as if looking for something he hadn't yet admitted he'd lost. Years of relentless corporate maneuvering had given him a polished, unshakable exterior, but it had also carved away much of his patience for anything outside his control. Since the divorce 5 years earlier, he had buried himself in his tech empire, telling himself that providing financially for his daughter was enough, even as months slipped by without a visit. His mission today had been simple, at least on paper. Deliver a brand new chrome blue bicycle for Hazel's 8th birthday, apologize for missing last weekend's celebration, and be back on the road to Dulles before dusk. No deep conversations, no lingering over coffee with Marin, just in and out. But as he pulled up to the narrow 2-story where his ex-wife lived with Hazel, something shifted in the air, a tightness in his chest that wasn't there before. The house itself was unassuming, with peeling white trim and a front porch that leaned slightly to one side. Marin had chosen it precisely because it was ordinary, safe, and far from the noise of Sterling's public life. He stepped inside without knocking. Old habits died hard. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and clean laundry. He moved toward the back, expecting to find Hazel in the kitchen or the living room. Instead, he stopped at the open door of a bedroom, whose faded floral wallpaper seemed like a leftover from some other family's past. The light through the curtains was thin and gold, pooling on the floor in a way that made the whole room feel smaller. On a sunken twin mattress, Hazel lay curled in a torn pink dress, her knees drawn up, her face smudged with dirt like thumbprints of a long day. Hazel Vance had inherited her father's sharp cheekbones, but not his restlessness. Her stillness was a language all its own. Her brown hair, tangled and dull from sleep, spilled across a pillow that had seen better days. Even asleep, there was a small furrow between her brows, a habit from the years she'd spent adjusting to 2 households in 2 very different worlds. Beside her, 2 German shepherds lay stretched out like sentinels, their bodies tense even in repose. The first, Rook, was larger, with a deep sable coat streaked with silver at the muzzle and eyes the color of dark amber. At 9 years old, he carried the calm authority of a seasoned working dog, his ears alert to every sound. The second, Valor, was slightly younger, with a black saddle marking across his back and a front leg swaddled in a too-tight bandage. Both dogs bore the lean, muscular build of animals trained for speed and endurance. Their forelegs were marked with fresh scrapes and more than one stitched wound. Sterling's breath caught. He knew them instantly. Rook and Valor had been his partners in the county's elite search and rescue K9 unit, a program he had bankrolled in the early years before his business empire demanded his full attention. Together, they had pulled survivors from collapsed buildings, tracked lost hikers through Appalachian fog, and even stood guard over disaster sites for days without relief. After a warehouse fire the previous year, he had been told they were retired to foster homes. Retired hadn't looked like this. From the corner of his eye, Sterling caught movement. Maren Carter, his ex-wife, leaned in the doorway behind him. Maren was 39, with an angular frame that carried both grace and a certain unyielding steadiness. She was of average height, with chestnut hair cropped neatly at her jawline and eyes of cool hazel that could either warm or harden in an instant. Years as a small-town high school art teacher had given her patience, but life with Sterling had taught her boundaries she now guarded fiercely. Since the divorce, she had raised Hazel with a mix of quiet resilience and deliberate distance from Sterling's world. "They limped in last night," Maren said in a low voice, mindful of Hazel's sleep. She pointed toward a faint smear of dried blood near the doorframe. "Hazel wouldn't sleep unless they stayed." Her gaze flicked to the dogs, then back to him. "And before you ask, no, I don't know where they came from, or who's been at our back gate." Sterling stepped further into the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The air felt heavier here, filled with the mingled scents of dog, antiseptic, and rain-damp clothing. Rook's tags were gone, the ring on his collar empty. Valor shifted his weight, the bandaged leg stretching toward Sterling. He knelt, careful not to wake Hazel, and brushed a hand over Valor's shoulder. The dog's muscles tensed briefly, then eased at the recognition of an old friend. Up close, Sterling noticed the bandage was too tight, not just covering a wound, but hiding something. The edges of the wrap were stained in a way that spoke less of careless patching and more of deliberate concealment. Valor nosed his wrist once, a brief, firm push half greeting, half warning. The room seemed to close in around him. Sterling's mind ran through possibilities, each darker than the last. Whoever had sent Rook and Valor here had done so with a purpose, and the blood at the door suggested it hadn't been a friendly return. He looked at Hazel again, her small chest rising and falling, one hand resting on Rook's thick fur. She had no idea about the shadows crowding their world right now. In that moment, Sterling's scattered intentions narrowed into a single, undeniable goal: protect Hazel and uncover who had sent his old partners back to him, bleeding. The mist of early morning still clung to Briar Hollow's narrow streets, turning the first light of the sun into a pale wash over the rooftops. The temperature had dropped overnight, leaving a brittle chill in the air, and the yard outside Maren's house was slick with dew. Inside Hazel's small bedroom, the faded floral wallpaper seemed even more washed out than the day before. The soft creak of the floor under Sterling's weight was the only sound, save for the slow breathing of his daughter and the quiet, watchful presence of the two German shepherds. Sterling crouched beside Valor, the younger of the two dogs, his eyes tracing the too-tight bandage on the dog's leg. Valor's coat, once sleek from regular conditioning, was dull in places, the kind of neglect that came from long weeks without proper care. Carefully, he unwound the gauze. Beneath the layers, tucked just above the stitched wound, was something metallic, a bead no larger than a pea, its surface matte black with a faint seam running around its middle. Sterling knew it immediately. A micro-tracker bead. He'd seen it tested in prototypes. And not just any tracker, this was hardware from Vance Protective Systems, the security branch of his own company. His gut tightened. Someone on his payroll had tagged Valor. The tracker wasn't for location recovery. This model transmitted a continuous feed of biometric data. Whoever was listening could monitor not only where Valor went, but when his heart rate spiked, when he exerted himself, when he was near other devices. In the wrong hands, it was a perfect way to track the people the dog was with, Hazel included. Behind him, there was the softest shuffle. Hazel was awake, though she didn't speak. Hazel Vance, 8 years old, was a child who had learned that silence could be armor. Since the divorce, she had developed what her school counselor later called selective mutism. She could speak, but she often chose not to, especially when her sense of safety was uncertain. She had Sterling's dark lashes and Maren's serious mouth, and in moments like this, her eyes, deep brown, almost black, seemed far older than her years. She padded over to him in bare feet, the hem of her pink dress brushing her knees. Without a word, she held out a sheet of paper from her small sketch pad. The crayon lines were bold, almost harsh. The drawing showed a tall man standing under the same wallpaper as the room they were in now. His jaw was square, his posture rigid, and a thick scar cut down his right cheek like a lightning strike. Underneath, Hazel had written in blocky letters, careful and uneven. He watched us. Sterling felt a pulse of heat in his temples. When? He asked softly. Hazel just pointed to the window, then the door. He understood. The man had been inside this house, or close enough to see the wallpaper through an opening. In the kitchen, Marin stood by the coffee maker, her robe pulled tight, hair still damp from the shower. She was already dressed underneath in work clothes, charcoal slacks, and a soft cream blouse, ready to teach her first period art class at the high school. Marin Carter didn't rattle easily, but she looked more tired than she had yesterday. As they spoke, another truth surfaced. The house, this modest two-story that smelled faintly of paint and lavender detergent, was 2 payments away from foreclosure. Marin admitted it only because Sterling asked directly. She had kept it from him to avoid the strings she knew he would attach to any help. He'd always been generous with money, but often expected influence in return, and Marin had built this quiet life specifically to keep Hazel out of the politics of Sterling's business empire. Sterling knew Hazel's counselor at Briar Hollow Elementary, a woman named Patricia Lanes, had noted the girl's selective mutism in reports. Reports Sterling had never bothered to read in full until now. Patricia, a short, round-shouldered woman in her late 50s with a voice like warm bread, had been the one to suggest the Therapy Dogs program for Hazel months earlier. Neither Rook nor Valor had been part of that program. Yet, here they were, and Hazel had spoken more in their presence, Marin said, than she had in weeks. Sterling moved to the living room, dialing his cell. He called Sheriff Ellen Price, an old friend from before the money had turned him into a public commodity. Ellen was in her early 50s, tall and wiry, with a streak of silver through her dark hair and eyes the gray of river stones. She had a reputation for doing things by the book, but wasn't afraid to bend the book if the right people were in danger. She had worked alongside Sterling on multiple search and rescue cases back when he was more present in the community. He told her only part of the truth. The dogs were back, they were hurt, and someone might have been on Marin's property last night. He kept the tracker quiet. If he named it now, Ellen would be bound to open an official inquiry, and without proof it could spook whoever had planted it. Sterling wanted to know exactly who was behind it before tipping his hand. After hanging up, he sent a text to his head of security, Dane Holloway. Dane was in his late 40s, with the build of a man who had been a Marine in his youth tight-cropped blonde hair, a square face, and a pair of pale blue eyes that could shift from friendly to predatory in a blink. Dane had been with Vance Protective Systems for over a decade, running the more discreet client operations. His reply came too fast. "I'll send a team to collect company property." Sterling stared at the words. Company property. The dogs weren't property. They were living, breathing partners, retired or not, and they had found their way back to his daughter, not to him. His stomach turned at the thought of letting Dane anywhere near them now. The back door opened and the quiet was broken by a familiar figure. Pete Gardner, the local mail carrier, stepped in holding a padded envelope. Pete was in his 60s, with a weathered face and a perpetual smell of tobacco on his uniform jacket. He had been delivering mail to this address since before Hazel was born. "Found this shoved in your mailbox," he said, handing it to Sterling. The label was blank. Inside was a single USB drive wrapped in masking tape, the tape marked with 2 words in black marker, "For him." Sterling pocketed it, heart thudding. If this was connected to Rook and Valor, it meant whoever was pulling the strings knew exactly where he'd be this morning. Back in the bedroom, Rook had risen and was pacing near the window. The dog's tail was low, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the fence. Valor, despite his injury, shifted to watch the door. Hazel, sitting cross-legged on the mattress, had begun to hum under her breath, a low, tuneless sound that Rook seemed to respond to by easing back to her side. The light through the curtains had warmed to a soft amber now, but it did nothing to ease the weight in Sterling's chest. There were too many moving parts, a tracker from his own company, a child's drawing of a scar-faced intruder, a house on the brink of being lost, and 2 loyal animals returned in a state that suggested flight from something or someone dangerous. And now, a USB drive that seemed like an invitation. Sterling knew he would have to move carefully. Ellen would come by later to check the property without raising suspicion. Dane Holloway was expecting a call that Sterling had no intention of making. And Hazel would need to believe that the man in the dark suit who had appeared in her doorway today was there for more than just a bicycle and an apology. Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the quiet street in full. It looked as harmless as any postcard. But inside, Sterling's goal had sharpened. Trace the tracker, find the man Hazel had drawn, and keep the dogs and his daughter safe until he knew why his past had come limping back to his door. The rain began just after dusk, a slow hiss at first, and then a steady drumming that blurred the outlines of the street lamps outside. By midnight, it had deepened into a needle-fine downpour, stitching silver threads across the porch steps and pooling in the cracked edges of the driveway. Briar Hollow was quiet under the storm, the few cars that passed sounding like ghosts sliding through water. Inside Marin's house, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wool from the dogs and the faint metallic tang of the coffee Sterling had left untouched on the counter. Hazel was asleep again on the mattress in her room, her knees tucked beneath the torn pink dress, one hand curled into Rook's ruff as if anchoring herself to something solid. The two shepherds bracketed her like living bookends. Rook near her head, Valor by her feet, the latter's injured leg stretched stiff but ready. Sterling stood in his bedroom doorway, still wearing the dark suit from earlier, the shoulders of the jacket faintly spotted from where he'd stepped outside to take a call. His heartbeat was too loud in his own ears, a deep, insistent drum that refused to slow. Marin moved through the rest of the house with deliberate quiet. She'd killed the lamps, letting the place fall into shadow. In the dimness, she looked like a shadow herself, tall, slim, robe tied over work slacks, hair pulled into a loose knot at the base of her neck. She'd always had a way of moving that wasted no motion, as if she were conserving her strength for moments that mattered. Then it happened. The soft, almost imperceptible scrape of tires on wet asphalt. Sterling glanced toward the front window in time to catch the low shape of a black SUV rolling to the curb, its lights off. It settled like a predator squatting in the rain. From the kitchen, Marin murmured, "That's not Ellen," meaning Sheriff Price. Sterling's hand drifted inside his jacket, fingers brushing the handle of the compact flashlight he'd taken to carrying. Before he could move, a sound came from the back of the house, the heavy, deliberate pressure of a shoulder slamming against a door not meant to withstand it. The first figure through was the man from Hazel's drawing, Scar Cheek. Up close, the wound was uglier raised and pale against the weathered brown of his skin, running from the corner of his right eye to the edge of his mouth. He was tall and rangy, dressed in a dark tactical jacket, his boots dripping onto the floor. His eyes swept the room with the flat efficiency of someone used to clearing spaces. Two more followed, both broad-shouldered, both wearing the black windbreakers and earpieces Sterling recognized from his own company's high-security units. "Hand over the shepherds," Scarcheek said, his voice a low rasp that cut through the rain's hum. A laminated badge flipped in his hand, VPS contractor access. "They're corporate assets." Rook's growl began as a vibration beneath Hazel's hand, deepening into a sound that filled the small room. Valor rose despite the taped leg, the fur along his spine lifting. Sterling stepped fully into the doorway, his body a barrier between the men and the mattress. "Not tonight," he said. His voice was low but steady, each syllable measured. He raised a small metal whistle to his lips, the one Rook and Valor had been trained to respond to in the field. The pitch was barely audible to human ears, but the dogs reacted instantly, shifting into a stance that meant hold, guard, no fear. The house erupted in chaos. Barking detonated in the narrow hallway, boots scuffed and thudded against the hardwood. Marin appeared from the side with a heavy flashlight in both hands, swinging it into the shoulder of the second intruder. The man grunted, stumbling into a wall. Hazel came bolt upright on the mattress, her eyes wide, body trembling, but Sterling noticed with a jolt she didn't scream. From somewhere down the street came the faint, rising wail of Sheriff Price's cruiser, but it was still too far away. Scarcheek lunged for Valor's collar. Sterling met him halfway, the impact sending both men crashing into the edge of a dresser. Something metallic clattered to the floor, a pistol, kicked free by the scramble. Rook darted forward, not to bite, but to block, his body driving the third man back toward the hall. Valor, despite the injury, twisted and drove Scarcheek toward the wall with a shoulder shove that bought Sterling just enough room to breathe. In the middle of it all, Hazel slid off the mattress and crouched low, Rook pivoting to flank her while Valor limped back to cover the other side. The dogs moved like trained wind, their focus absolute. The smell of wet wool and old wallpaper paste pressed in on Sterling, mingled with the copper scent of adrenaline in his own mouth. Somewhere behind the immediacy of fists and breath and rain, he understood the truth of it. His own company, the empire he had built, had sent war to his daughter's bedroom. A new sound cut through, a sharp, commanding female voice from the front hall. "Briar Hollow Sheriff's Department. Hands where I can see them." Sheriff Ellen Price stepped into view, rain slicking her uniform cap, service pistol steady in her grasp. Behind her came Deputy Matt Colson, a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s with a fresh scar on his chin and the eager tension of someone only a few years into the badge. The two surviving intruders froze, their eyes darting between Ellen and the dogs. Scarcheek's mouth tightened, but he raised his hand slowly. Sterling could see the calculation in his gaze, not fear, but the recognition that this fight was no longer one he could win here. Ellen moved first to Hazel, her voice softening in an instant. "You okay, sweetheart?" Hazel didn't answer, but she didn't pull away when Ellen's gloved hand brushed her shoulder. That was answer enough for Ellen. Marin was breathing hard, her knuckles white around the flashlight. "Get them out," she said flatly. Ellen's eyes flicked to Sterling, a silent question he answered with a curt nod. The deputies moved in, securing the three men with plastic cuffs, reading them their rights over the steady hiss of the rain. Rook and Valor held their positions until Sterling gave a quiet release command. Only then did their bodies loosen, the intensity in their eyes easing just enough to check Hazel with quick, reassuring nudges. By the time the SUV was towed and the intruders driven off in separate cruisers, the house was left in a strange hush, broken only by Hazel's steady breathing and the distant drip of rainwater from the eaves. Sterling closed the bedroom door gently. He knew tonight's fight was only the surface of something deeper and far more dangerous. And whatever came next, the line between his business empire and his family had already been crossed in a way that could never be undone. The air inside the house felt heavier than the storm outside, the kind of oppressive weight that pressed against the lungs. Sheriff Price's deputies had separated the three intruders into the dining room, but Scarcheek had demanded to speak to Sterling alone. Ellen allowed it, on the condition she stayed within earshot. The dining room's single overhead light swung slightly, casting long shadows over the battered man at the table. His VPS windbreaker was damp, streaked with mud from the scuffle, but his eyes were still bright with the gleam of someone holding cards they believed were worth more than force. Scarcheek's real name, Sterling now remembered, was Kurt Danner. Years ago, Kurt had been an up-and-coming field coordinator for VPS, sharp, ambitious, and willing to bend rules for results. A mission in Caracas had ended his career on paper, but clearly Holloway had kept him on in the shadows. Kurt was tall but wiry, with the taut, sinewy build of someone who spent more time running back-alley errands than in a gym. That pale scar on his cheek looked almost white in the dim light, twisting when he grinned without humor. Sterling stood across from him, hands resting flat on the edge of the table. The dogs were in the next room with Hazel, but he could still hear the faint shift of Rook's weight on the floorboards, the quiet tap of Valor's nails whenever Hazel moved. Kurt spat blood into a napkin, then leaned forward. "Sign the NDA," he said, voice low enough that it almost merged with the rain on the windows. "Give Holloway full control of what's left of your philanthropy, and we walk. No more night visits, no more trouble. Refuse, and the world sees how your little non-profit ran dogs in Black Ops trials." The words hit like a blow. Sterling knew it didn't matter if Kurt's accusation was half-truth, rumor, or outright lie. If Holloway's people spun it right, the fallout would be catastrophic. Every media outlet in the country would salivate over the story, dragging Hazel into headlines she could never erase. Worse, the kernel of plausibility was there. Sterling had funded projects without oversight, too busy chasing profit margins to ask hard questions about field protocols. A chair scraped behind him. Marin had come into the doorway, her robe gone, replaced with a gray sweater and jeans, her hair still damp from washing out the scent of the fight. She stepped into the space between Sterling and Kurt, her back straight, her expression hard. "Pick your daughter, Sterling, not your brand." The sentence landed like a verdict. Sterling's jaw clenched, the memory of every time he'd chosen the easier meeting over the harder conversation with Hazel burning hot in his chest. Behind them, Hazel sat cross-legged on the mattress, Rook's great head resting against her hip. She reached down, fingers brushing the dog's ear, and for the first time in months her voice cut through the tension, hoarse but steady. "Please, stay." It was the sound of her choosing him, and it cracked something open. Sterling's decision came sharp and clean. He took out his phone, swiped to the call log, and tapped the screen. "Speaker," he said, the single word slicing through Kurt's smirk. He scrolled to a group contact labeled County Safety Alliance and hit call. Sheriff Price's voice answered first. "Vance, we're still on site." Sterling didn't let her finish. "You're all live," he said, his voice carrying in the small room. "Sheriff Price, County Recorder's Office, and 3 investigative reporters who don't owe me a damn thing." He looked straight at Kurt. "You're on tape. Try me." For the first time, Kurt's composure faltered. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The gamble had shifted. From the front of the house came the sudden slam of the door bursting open. More deputies flooded the hallway too, in standard patrol uniforms, one in plain clothes with the lean frame of a detective. The plainclothes officer was Detective Mara Lang, a recent transfer from Richmond. In her late 30s, with close-cropped dark hair and a narrow, intense gaze, she carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who'd faced worse and won. She quickly took control of the scene, ordering the 2 deputies to secure the exits. Kurt bolted for the kitchen. Valor, hearing the movement, pushed himself to his feet despite the limp and moved with uncanny precision, cutting off Kurt's escape angle before the man could reach the back door. Rook appeared in the doorway a second later, body rigid, a wall of muscle and discipline between Hazel and harm. The confrontation lasted seconds. Kurt was forced back into the dining room, his hands raised as Detective Lang closed the cuffs around his wrists. The click of metal was almost drowned by the rain, but to Sterling it was the loudest, cleanest sound of the night. Ellen stepped in, nodding toward the hallway. "We'll take it from here." Sterling finally let out the breath he'd been holding. His shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment settling in. Hazel was safe for now, and the threat that had walked into her room was in custody. But the larger storm, the one with Holloway's name written all over it, was still out there, waiting. By the time the sun rose over Briar Hollow, the fight had shifted from Sterling's living room to boardrooms and courthouse steps. The VPS board had convened an emergency meeting at dawn, and their intentions were obvious. Vote Sterling out before his public defiance could stain the company's name. But Sterling Vance, dressed in a charcoal suit without a tie, was already one step ahead. He walked into the sleek glass conference room with a single folder in his hand, laid it on the table, and announced in the same even voice he'd used to close billion-dollar deals, "I resign, effective immediately." The faces around the table flickered relief from some, thinly veiled satisfaction from others. Dane Holloway was conspicuously absent, but Sterling knew that absence wouldn't save him. The folder contained signed dissolutions of his key contracts and a written authorization to release VPS's internal communications from the past 2 years. By the time he stepped back into the gray light outside, the documents were already with Sheriff Price. On the courthouse steps, Ellen Price stood beside him. The sheriff was still in her duty jacket, her salt and pepper hair damp from the morning drizzle, her expression carved from stone. Sterling addressed the small crowd of reporters with calm precision, laying out the timeline. The warehouse fire, the questionable K9 deployments, and the chain of command that led to Dane Holloway. He named names without hesitation. Ellen confirmed that Holloway had been indicted on charges of conspiracy, obstruction, and multiple violations of animal welfare statutes. The warehouse incident that had supposedly retired Rook and Valor was now officially reopened as a criminal investigation. The fallout was immediate. VPS stock began its slide before lunch. But for the first time in months, Sterling felt no urge to check the numbers. His world was shifting, and this time he intended to shape it by different measures. Later that afternoon, Sterling drove the winding 2-lane back to Marin's house. The weather had softened into a mild warmth, the air carrying the smell of damp earth and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Hazel was on the porch with Rook lying at her feet, Valor stretched across the top step like a sentry. She waved when she saw him, a small smile breaking across her face. Inside, Marin sat at the kitchen table grading sketchbook assignments, her hair pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder. She looked up when he entered, wary at first, but her expression softened when he slid a single manila envelope across the table. "What's this?" she asked. "The deed," Sterling said simply. "The house is in your name now. No lien, no conditions. Hazel needs one place that stays." Marin hesitated, fingers resting on the envelope. She had always been cautious with his offers, knowing how easily generosity could come tangled with influence. But there was no weight in his tone now, no bargaining in his eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation circling Hazel's routines, her progress at school, and how best to protect the fragile sense of safety she'd begun to reclaim. Sterling proposed a new custody arrangement: shared weeks, consistent rules, and one non-negotiable: no phones at the dinner table. Marin arched an eyebrow at that, amused. "You, Mr. Vance, without a phone at dinner? That's a bigger miracle than retiring from VPS." "Still," she agreed. That evening, with the agreement settling between them like fresh mortar, Sterling took a walk with Hazel and the dogs through the backyard. The oak tree at the far edge of the yard stood wide and strong, its roots pushing up the grass in gentle ridges. Hazel carried a small mason jar in both hands, the tracker bead glinting faintly inside. "Where should we put it?" she asked. "Here," Sterling said, kneeling at the base of the oak. He dug a shallow hole with the heel of his hand, placed the jar inside, and covered it with soil. Hazel set a smooth stone over the spot, painted gold with a brush so thick the bristles had left tiny ridges. On the top she'd written, in careful letters, "For brave things that heal." The crickets were loud in the dusk, their chorus rising and falling like the tide. Hazel's voice barely rose above it when she said, "We stay." She smiled, the kind of small, quiet smile that felt heavier than any public speech. Both Rook and Valor leaned into her at the same time, the weight of their bodies anchoring her to the moment. In the kitchen afterward, Hazel taped a new sheet of paper to the refrigerator, written in crayon. The rules were simple. Always knock. No yelling. Ask before hugs. Pancakes on Sundays. Pancakes on. And at the bottom, underlined twice in purple, "We stay." Marin read them aloud with a smile, and Sterling nodded at each one as if committing them to memory. The list wasn't just house rules, it was a map for what came next. The house smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh paint that morning. A warm September breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the muffled sound of lawnmowers from down the street. Marin had insisted it was time to replace Hazel's old mattress, the one that had borne not just her weight, but the protective forms of Rook and Valor on the worst nights. Sterling agreed, partly because Hazel had outgrown it, and partly because he wanted her room to feel wholly hers again. Sterling stood in the middle of the floral wallpapered room, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. His tie was still draped over a chair. He had stopped wearing it tightly knotted at home. Hazel sat cross-legged on the rug with a box of markers, drawing Rook and Valor with exaggerated ears and capes like superheroes. Rook lay nearby, tracking the movement of the new mattress being carried in by a delivery man in a green work shirt. As the old mattress was lifted away, the bed frame scraped across the floorboards, and Rook's ears flicked forward. He moved to the corner, sniffed hard, and then began pawing at a seam in the wood. The sound was sharp and deliberate, one claw catching on something loose. Sterling crouched beside him and ran his fingers along the board. One end lifted slightly with a faint creak. "Hold on," Sterling murmured. He pried the plank free, revealing a narrow cavity filled with dust and the faint scent of machine oil. Inside was a small tin, the kind that might once have held biscuits or tobacco. The surface was dented, its paint flaked away in places, but the lid was still tight. Alongside it lay a sleek, black USB thumb drive, modern, incongruous against the relic. Hazel set her drawing aside and scooted closer, eyes wide. Valor limped over from the rug, still favoring his once injured leg, and nosed the tin gently toward Sterling as though urging him to take it. Sterling opened the tin first. Inside were a stack of brittle papers, shipping manifests, coded memos, and stamped forms bearing the faded VPS letterhead. Dates from 2 years ago leapt out at him, right around the time of the warehouse fire. Each sheet detailed transfers of K9 assets and off-site training orders, signed by names he recognized from the old chain of command. The thumb drive was something else entirely encrypted, its casing etched with a serial code Sterling knew meant internal security archives. Only someone on the inside, like Holloway, could have ordered this material to be hidden. Together, the contents were enough to do more than indict a single man. They could dismantle whatever remained of the Black Ops K9 program Holloway had nurtured in the shadows. Later that afternoon, Sterling sat in Sheriff Price's office, the tin and drive on the desk between them. Ellen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression halfway between disbelief and satisfaction. "You know this closes the circle," she said. "No more speculation. We can name every last player still standing." They worked through the chain of custody, arranging for the drive's contents to be decrypted by the county's cybercrimes unit. Within a week, VPS's dirty unit was formally dismantled. The county commission, emboldened by the scandal's exposure, announced the creation of a K9 retirement and youth safety fund seeded by a personal endowment from Sterling's own accounts. Marin agreed to manage it, her steady, no-nonsense approach a perfect counterbalance to Sterling's public profile. On a quiet Friday evening, Ellen handed Sterling a folded form outside the courthouse. "Volunteer search and rescue handler," she said. "Weekends only. You show up for the right things, Vance. That's the deal." Sterling accepted with a nod. It was a far cry from boardrooms and quarterly reports, but it felt more like a promotion than any corporate title he'd ever worn. Months passed. September's green gave way to October's gold, and then to the bare branches of December. The house felt fuller now, not just with Hazel's laughter, but with the rhythm of shared meals, shared rules, and the grounding presence of Rook and Valor. The dogs' scars were fading, their coats thick and healthy again, the hard lines of constant vigilance softening into something calmer, though never less watchful. On Hazel's 9th birthday, the floral wallpapered room looked transformed. A new bed with a maple headboard stood where the old mattress had been. Bookshelves lined one wall, and the rug had been replaced with one Hazel had chosen herself, covered in bright shapes like spilled paint. The air smelled of vanilla frosting from the cake cooling in the kitchen. Sterling stood in the doorway, wearing his black suit out of habit rather than armor. In his hand was a small gift bag with Hazel's name on the tag. Marin stood just behind him in the hall, leaning against the frame, her hair loose and her smile quiet. Hazel sat on the bed, her legs tucked beneath her, reading aloud from a book about rescue dogs. Rook was at her side, his head resting on her lap, eyes half closed in contentment. Valor lay stretched at the foot of the bed, his gaze following the rhythm of her voice. She paused mid-sentence and looked up at Sterling. "Dad?" "Yeah, Bug?" Her brow furrowed in thought. "Do dogs know when a family is fixed?" Sterling's gaze drifted past her to Marin in the hall, then to the gold-painted stone on the windowsill, the one marking the jar buried under the oak. He looked back to the two shepherds whose eyes had always told the truth. "They know when a family stays," he said. Hazel smiled at that answer, the kind of smile that folded itself away for later, to be kept. And this time, Sterling thought, they all did. Sometimes life reminds us that healing is not about erasing the past, but about choosing to stay, to protect, and to grow together, no matter the scars. Just like Sterling, Hazel, Marin, Rook, and Valor, we can all decide to build a place where trust is real and love is steady. In our everyday lives, that might mean showing up for family dinners, listening without judgment, or simply being present when someone needs us most. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this. May God bless everyone watching and keep your families safe. If you believe in the power of staying and protecting the ones you love, comment Amen below.